The researcher's name was Elena Iturriaga. She'd been coming to this patch of northern Mexico every month for 2 years, and she knew every square meter of this place the way you know a room you've cleaned 1,000 times. Dead grass, cracked clay, a horizon that looked like something had given up on it. She knew exactly what to expect when she drove out that morning in October. She didn't expect to see cattle egrets. Cattle egrets don't show up in dead grassland. They follow large animals, specifically large herbivores that disturb the soil and flush insects into the air. There hadn't been large herbivores here in generations. And yet, 4 white birds picking through grass that was, she stopped the truck, actually green, actually thick, in a spot she remembered as hard-packed earth. She got out and knelt down and put her hand on the ground. It was soft. 23 animals did this. 23 bison, released into barren grassland 18 months earlier. And what unfolded after that is one of those stories where the more you dig into the facts, the more you realize the facts are trying to tell you something much larger than the story itself. So let's dig. Mexico's Chihuahuan grasslands cover about 200,000 square kilometers across northern Mexico and the southwestern United States. If you look at old maps, at historical accounts from Spanish missionaries in the 1600s, at the journals of early naturalists, you see a landscape that was almost incomprehensibly alive. Pronghorn antelope moving in herds of thousands. Prairie dogs honeycombing the ground in colonies so dense that observers estimated hundreds of millions of individuals across the region. Burrowing owls, ferruginous hawks, golden eagles. And underneath all of it, serving as the architect of the whole system, the American bison. Bison were everywhere in this ecosystem once. Not in the hundreds, not in the thousands, millions. By 1900, they were gone, hunted out. The last wild bison in northern Mexico were shot sometime in the early 20th century, and the land didn't recover. It collapsed. When you remove the animal that entire ecosystems evolved around, you don't just get an ecosystem with a gap in it. You get a different ecosystem, a degraded one. The prairie dogs declined without the bison-disturbed soil they depended on. The hawks declined without the prairie dogs. Grass monocultures spread because there was no longer a force creating habitat diversity. And the land compacted, slowly, over decades, becoming exactly what Elena had been driving out to document. A hardpan of cracked clay and sparse, unvaried grass that held almost no water, supported almost no life, and was losing ground to shrub encroachment every year. This is not a story about one bad thing that happened in one place. This is a story about a chain reaction, and what happens when you reverse it. The project was called Rewilding Chihuahuan Grasslands, and when it was proposed, the people who heard about it divided into 2 camps almost immediately. One camp thought it was overdue. The other thought it was hopelessly naive. The naive camp had a point. 23 bison is not a lot of bison. The area they were being released into. A section of degraded private ranch land, converted into a conservation area, was large, but it was not the Serengeti. The soil was compacted, the grass was sparse, the water table was stressed. Introducing large herbivores into degraded rangeland had, historically, made things worse. Cattle had contributed to the degradation of this exact landscape over the course of a century. What made anyone think bison would be different? The answer is in what bison actually do, as opposed to what cattle do. And this is where the story gets genuinely strange. Cattle graze the way a lawnmower works, systematically, evenly, until the grass is short everywhere. Bison graze the way a hurricane moves, intensely chaotically, and then gone. A herd of bison hits an area hard, cropping plants down to the root in some spots and leaving others barely touched, then moves on. This movement pattern was shaped by predation pressure over millions of years. Bison evolved being chased by wolves, short-faced bears, dire wolves, and so they evolved to not stay in one place. The constant movement is not a quirk, it's the entire mechanism. When bison graze an area intensely and then leave, the plants that get heavily cropped come back stronger. It stimulates root growth, tillers new shoots. The areas left alone develop into taller, denser refuges for different species. You get, within a few hundred meters, completely different vegetation structures. That heterogeneity is habitat. It's the difference between a monoculture and an ecosystem. And then there are the wallows. Bison roll. They roll in dry soil to create dust baths, and over time these wallows, shallow depressions, sometimes several meters across, become the most important microhabitats in the grassland. During the rainy season, they fill with water. They become temporary wetlands. Invertebrates colonize them. Amphibians find them. Migratory birds use them as stopover sites. A single wallow can host dozens of species that would have no foothold in the unbroken flat grassland around it. And then there is what bison do to the soil just by walking. Their hooves, heavy, cloven, constantly moving, break the compacted crust that forms on degraded rangeland. Every step is a small act of aeration. Water that would have sheeted off the hardpan surface and run into arroyos now percolates. The moisture stays in the soil. The roots go deeper. The grass gets more stable. The cycle begins. Scientists knew all of this in theory. But theory and a specific patch of northern Mexican grassland are two different things. The first months after the release were not dramatic. The 23 bison explored, grazed, moved around the property. Researchers recorded their locations, tracked movement patterns, measured soil compaction at sampling points. Nothing in the data jumped out. The bison looked healthy. The grassland looked roughly the same. Then, around month 7, the soil compaction readings started shifting. Not everywhere, just along the main movement corridors, the paths the herd used most often. The crust was loosening. Grass density in those corridors was measurably higher than in control zones. By month 10, the first wallows appeared. The herd had identified low spots and started working them. By the following spring, those wallows held water for the first time. And by midsummer, researchers were cataloging invertebrates in wallow water that simply had not been observed in this area in living memory. Water scavenger beetles, fairy shrimp, midge larvae. The beginning of a food chain that hadn't existed here. The birds came next. Not just the cattle egrets Elena saw that October morning. Those were a symbol, a visible signal, easy to notice from a truck window. The real story was in the point counts. Researchers doing standardized bird surveys started recording species they hadn't listed in previous surveys. Grassland obligates. Species that require structurally diverse grassland and cannot survive in monocultures started showing up. Lark buntings, Sprague's pipits, Baird's sparrows. These are birds that have been declining across North America for decades. And here they were, in a degraded Mexican grassland that 18 months ago looked like it was on its way to becoming desert. That's when the tone of the scientific papers started changing. Not in the language. Scientific language is trained to be measured, cautious, careful. But between the lines, in the phrasing, in the choice of what to highlight, you could feel it. This was not behaving like a typical restoration project. Typical restoration takes decades. It requires massive intervention, seeding, soil amendment, water management, fencing to rotate grazing pressure. This was 23 animals doing what 23 animals do naturally, and the system was responding faster than any model had predicted. Significantly faster. The question nobody could quite answer: why? The leading hypothesis, the one gaining the most traction among ecologists who've looked at the data, is what some researchers are calling the memory hypothesis. And it's the part of this story that makes you stop and sit with it for a minute. Ecosystems have memory, not in a mystical sense, in a very literal, biological one. The soil in the Chihuahuan grassland still contains the seed bank, the fungal networks, the dormant spores of plants and organisms that evolved alongside Bison over thousands of years. The system hadn't forgotten what it was supposed to be. It had simply been waiting for the right signal. Bison are the signal. When the hooves broke the crust, when the wallows filled, when the dung began attracting beetles, which attracted birds, the system recognized what was happening. The dormant pieces activated. Species that had been holding on in small refuges at the margins of the landscape moved in. The grassland wasn't being built from scratch. It was being reminded of itself. There's a word for this in ecology: resilience. But resilience is usually discussed in the abstract, as a property systems might theoretically have. What the Chihuahuan data suggests is that resilience can be faster and more complete than anyone working on the problem had dared to assume. That a system can be degraded for a century and still, given the right keystone, reassemble itself in 18 months. 23 animals, 18 months. Measurable, documented, peer-reviewed transformation. That number, 23, keeps coming back. Because conservation is usually a story of insufficient resources, of too little too late, of scale that never matches ambition. 23 feels laughably small. It's smaller than the number of people in most offices. It's the number of players on 2 basketball teams. And yet in a system already encoded with the right biological memory, 23 keystone animals is enough to start a cascade that runs on its own momentum. If that finding makes you want to argue with it, or verify it, or ask what other degraded ecosystems might still have that kind of memory locked in their soil, leave that in the comments. Because that's exactly the question researchers are now asking, and the answers are going to shape conservation strategy for the next generation. I want to keep following this story here, and I want to know what piece of it landed hardest for you. There's a larger argument underneath all of this, and it's worth making directly, because it gets lost in the specifics. We have spent a century thinking about nature as something we manage, a system we maintain by adding resources, controlling variables, intervening constantly. The idea that a degraded ecosystem might restore itself, given the right catalyst, runs against that assumption. It suggests that what nature most needs, in many cases, is not our management but our restraint. Not our addition of things, but our replacement of the things we took. That's harder than it sounds. It requires letting go of control in landscapes, where we've exercised control for generations. It requires trusting ecological memory over short-term human intuition. It requires believing that a grassland knows, on some level, what it's supposed to be. 23 bison proved that belief is not naive, it's empirical. The project isn't done. The herd is growing. The data continues. Researchers are asking whether similar interventions, small, targeted, keystone species reintroductions, could work in other degraded grasslands across Mexico and beyond. The Chihuahuan grasslands, even in their current diminished state, are one of the most biodiverse arid grassland systems on Earth. What they could become, with the right catalyst, is a question that's starting to look less like a fantasy and more like a plan. Elena Iturriaga still drives out to that patch of grassland. The cattle egrets are still there. So are species she's never had to write down in this location before. The grass is thick in the wallow corridors. The soil is soft where bison hooves have been working. She says the strangest part is the sound. A grassland with a life in it sounds different from a dead one. There's insect noise, bird noise, wind moving through grass that's tall enough to move. It's not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It just sounds like something that was always supposed to be there.